I was originally invited for the second conference on morality, but as Professor Tamer mentioned, when I noticed that this conference had lost its Jewish participant, I volunteered, not because I know a great deal about the topic of study of emotion, but I had a 40-page paper that I wrote with a colleague 5 years ago on joy for a project at the Yale Divinity School on joy and the good life. And my colleague and I contributed the Jewish piece. It hadn't been published in that form. So this presentation is top-heavy on the emotion of joy. I had a week to put this together. Just to let you know, it's a 13-page double-spaced paper. I'm going to read it. It will take about 35 minutes. Don't give up hope. Okay, so the Bible depicts both its human characters and its divine one as passionate. From the start, the characters display complex emotions rather than simple primordial impulses. In Genesis chapter 2, the text observes that Adam and Eve were naked, quote, yet they felt no shame. V'lo yitbosheshu, end quote. In our world, shame is often the appropriate emotion to feel when one is naked in the presence of another. But our world had not yet been born. The story is a genealogy of shame, a story about how our moral cosmos came to be. Soon enough, shame enters the picture, along with moral awareness. Then shame mixes with fear. The pair heard God walking in the garden and were afraid to be seen. Confessing their shame at being naked and afraid, the man blames the woman for his condition, and the woman blames the serpent. They try to relinquish responsibility, to cover their conscience with dissembling, as they had earlier covered their genitalia with leaves. God decrees that the woman will feel pain in childbirth, yet, nevertheless, she will have sexual desire for her husband. She will feel lust for him. These simple stories present a complex layering of emotions. They are phenomenologically, humanly recognizable. In short order, we learn of the enmity of Cain, Eve's eldest son, toward his brother Abel. God, for mysterious reasons, rejects Cain's sacrificial offering. Cain was, quote, much distressed, and his face fell, end quote. Soon his feeling of rejection swelled into rage, and he killed his brother. God punishes him with exile. Cain responds with despair and fear. He fears his impending vulnerability. Anyone who meets me may kill me, he says. God promises to take revenge on anyone who hurts Cain. Rabbinic Midrash, ancient rabbinic biblical commentary, trying to understand God's mercy toward Cain, ascribes another emotional attitude to him. Cain realizes the harm that he has caused and repents. Repentance, with its recognition of sin, feeling of contrition, and moral resolve to improve, is the reason why God did not treat Cain as Cain had treated Abel, according to the rabbis. So these early biblical stories throw us into the thick of emotionality. The emotion-tinted portrayal of the characters allows us to understand them as our fellows. Without that shared basis of empathy and, at times, sympathy, the stories would fail as literature, as would the overall ethical purpose of the text. The stories remind us that the emotions are not peripheral to human life, but central. Commenting on the centrality of the emotions to our mode of being, the British philosopher P.M.S. Hacker writes, quote, "A life bereft of emotion would not be worth living, for it would be a life without love or affection, lacking joy and delight, wanting enthusiasm and excitement. It would be driven by arbitrary wants, inclinations, and natural appetites. It would be a life in which we encountered the works of nature and of man without awe or wonder, without curiosity or admiration. There can be no happiness without such emotions. It would also be a life without pity and compassion, grief and sorrow, a life immune to empathy and to human fraternity and to recognition of the human condition." End quote. Insofar as the Bible aims at depicting the human condition and showing us how our Creator wants us to live within its frame of possibilities and constraints, a sustained focus on the emotions is critical. Given that the Jewish textual tradition takes emotions seriously as a constitutive element of human nature and a crucial dimension of the human condition, does Judaism have anything distinctive to say about the emotions? Does it theorize, or more modestly, provide some material for theorizing about the emotions? I think that it does. To anticipate, in the Bible, God is depicted as commanding certain emotions. Israel is told to love God, Deuteronomy 6:5, as well as to fear him, Deuteronomy 6:2. The Israelites are told to love one another as neighbors, Leviticus 19:18. They are told not to resent, Leviticus 19:17, or envy one another, Exodus 20:14. They are also told to rejoice on their sacred festivals. This conjunction of emotion and commandment is central to biblical religion and to subsequent Judaism. And this raises the question, how can emotions be commanded? If this is not a distinctive problem, it is at least a highly interesting one. In this brief paper, I hope to clarify the general outlines of Judaism's concept of commanded emotions. I begin with some preliminary philosophical considerations. I'm trained as a philosopher. Here I stand. I can do no other. So I have to start with philosophy. And then I'll turn to Judaism's treatment of one emotion, joy. We will look at biblical and rabbinic texts that command rejoicing on festivals and theorize the relation between commandment and emotion. So, contemporary philosophy of mind, often in league with neuroscience, has taken an interest in emotions. The old sterile opposition between emotion and reason has crumbled. The recent focus on consciousness, rather than on classic epistemological topics such as belief, knowledge, justification, truth, etc., has broadened the study of mind. Relatedly, evolutionary psychology, building on Darwin, has attempted to theorize the connections between animal and human emotions against the background of natural selection. By hypothesis, creatures that had emotional reactions to environmental conditions, even at an instinctual level, had survival advantages over creatures that did not. One of these advantages was the emergence of primitive forms of consciousness based on emotional reactions. Consciousness studies spans both animal and human experience, thus putting emotions front and center. Assuming a continuum in the development of emotion-based consciousness, humans enter the picture after millions of years of mammalian emotional development, especially among social primates. The emergence of human language and of the human niche refined the mammalian capacity for feeling emotion into a meta-level phenomenon. For example, a human being, unlike other primates, can not only feel lust, but can feel shame about feeling lusty. Some theorists who see emotion, the so-called affective consciousness, as the origin of phenomenal consciousness, posit this meta-level emotionality as the origin of distinctively human sentience. That is, the human capacity to have emotions about emotions enables the human capacity for metacognition, thinking thoughts about thoughts. Feelings and thoughts, emotions and beliefs are richly interrelated for human beings. The progress of neuroscience in identifying brain regions and feedback loops that integrate emotional response with cognitive activity gives a biological basis to these speculations. The upshot is that if our distinctively human phenomenal consciousness and self-consciousness has its roots in mammalian emotionality, then emotions are crucial to understanding the human, not just phenomenologically, but in evolutionary terms as well. Philosophical models that scant emotion in favor of a notion of reason scrubbed clean of emotional involvement are, to say the very least, explanatorily inadequate. Thus, contemporary thinking about emotions has returned in a way to ancient theories such as that of the Stoics, which see strong links between emotion and belief. Although the Western tradition has always thematized the tensions between emotion and reason, recall Plato's famous analogy of the chariot in the Phaedrus, it has also characterized the emotions as having doxastic and evaluative, that is, cognitive components. For example, we respond with indignation to someone who has insulted us because we judge something to be an insult. We can do that spontaneously or reflectively because we have a developed social concept of the insult. Another example, we can think about whether having an ice cream cone would make us happy, or, after an initial experience of enjoyment, would lead to feelings of guilt about violating our diet, because we have concepts such as health, self-control, permissible pleasures, and so on. The cognitive dimension of emotion is not extraneous, as if emotion were a raw surge of feeling and thought were literally an afterthought. The so-called hydraulic model of emotion introduced by early modern philosophy has given way to a richer conception of emotion introduced by Stoicism. The standard model of emotion in contemporary philosophy adduces three components: a belief, an evaluation, and a feeling. To continue with the example of the insult, one has a belief that one was insulted. One evaluates the belief negatively. One feels anger, contempt, frustration, or all of these and more. Note that the causal relations among beliefs, evaluations, and feelings need not be, and seldom are, linear. Although we are used to thinking of emotions as radically subjective private events, albeit manifested in public ways such as facial expression or consequent action, note how important objective public criteria are on this analysis of emotion. Beliefs can be true or false, and that's not a private matter, but rather a matter of using concepts, which is to say, using our shared language correctly. Evaluations are judgments that can properly be assessed by others. If the presumably offending party had not insulted you, but was only making a playful, teasing comment out of affection rather than malice, your belief that you had been insulted would have been factually in error. Your negative evaluation would have been wrong. The emotion of indignation would have been inappropriate, and you should apologize. The contemporary analysis of emotions takes them out of the context of sheer subjectivity and embeds them in a social world structured by language, concepts, and practices. The late Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick thinks that emotions can be inappropriate in three ways. The belief can be false, the evaluation can be wrong, or the feeling can be disproportionate to the evaluation. Thus, to turn it around, an emotion, quote, fits when the belief is true, the evaluation is correct, and the feeling is proportionate to the evaluation, end quote. Nozick is concerned to develop these criteria of fitness because he sees emotion not as subjective and free-floating, but as linking us to the world in important ways. In particular, emotions relate us to what Nozick takes, controversially, to be external intrinsic value. When an emotion fits the circumstances, it reveals something of the phenomenal and axiological complexity of the world. Emotions, Nozick claims, are, quote, a response to value, end quote. When we respond emotionally to the world, we respond to what is worth caring about. What is worth caring about, on Nozick's view, is objectively valuable. My overall strategy here is to try to deconstruct the subjectivity of emotions. PMS Hacker takes up the same theme. He carefully distinguishes emotions from appetites, such as hunger and thirst, felt desires, such as urgings, cravings, and impulses, moods, such as cheerfulness or depression, and agitations, such as excitement or amazement. The distinguishing feature of emotions is responsiveness to value. Nozick's point reiterated by Hacker. Hacker says, quote, unlike agitations, which are merely spontaneous reactions, emotions exhibit what we care about. Hence, unlike agitations, they are intimately linked, especially in the form of enduring or persisting emotions, with intentional action and motivation to attain, conserve, and protect what we care about, and to respond to or avoid what we are averse to and what is detrimental to what we care about. Human beings who are generally deficient in their emotional responses are deemed to be unfeeling, unemotional, passionless. They are held to be cold, impassive, detached, aloof, or stony. This is a fault of character, for it betokens not caring about what one should care about. End quote. So the idea in both of these philosophers that emotions link us to what we ought to care about seems to me fruitful for an analysis of emotion in Jewish texts. If we ought to care about loving God, loving our neighbor, and not hating or envying him or her, the idea that we can be morally required, that is to say commanded, to affirm these goods begins to become intelligible. When we stop thinking of emotions as precognitive surges of feeling and see them as socially contextual, evaluative responses to the axiological dimension of reality, the commanded nature of at least some emotions in the Torah is less strange than it first appears to be. So now we're going to look at the case of joy. Greek ethics and Greek teaching about the nature and role of the passions is framed by the general question of how to live, of what is the best form of life for human beings. The Bible, although not theoretical in the sense of Greek philosophy, also addresses these fundamental questions. It understands the good life for human beings in terms of service to God. The emotions that it commands, such as love, reverence, and joy, should be understood in the Israelite context of life as service to God. Biblical literature draws from and modifies Mesopotamian antecedents. In Mesopotamia, people thought of themselves as serfs, tending the gods' estates. In exchange for their service, they received the protection of the deity. This arrangement was not merely transactional, however. Ideally, it was enlivened by feelings of joy and gratitude to the gods. The Mesopotamian was supposed to serve the god in joy, which philological studies of Akkadians show meant free and uncoerced willingness. The ancient Israelite also understood him or herself to have a purpose in the world, which was to be a servant, Elohim, Eved, of God. The life of a divine servant should not be one of drudgery and oppression, as in Egyptian bondage, but one of joy. The Israelites were chosen for and chose service to God. Free and uncoerced in their choice of divine service, their worship should be characterized by joyous, enthusiastic devotion. Psalm 100, a liturgical script for entering the Jerusalem temple, captures this thought. Raise a shout for the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord in gladness, b'simcha. Come into his presence with shouts of joy, ra'anana. Acknowledge that the Lord is God. He made us, and we are his people, the flock he tends. Enter his gates with praise, his courts with acclamation. Praise him, bless his name, for the Lord is good. His steadfast love is eternal, his faithfulness is for all generations. This psalm prescribes what worshipers should do as they enter the precincts of the temple. They should shout jubilantly, worship willingly and unreservedly, entering through the gates with praises and blessings on their lips. These emotions and actions were fit for the occasion. The Psalms, of course, are religious poetry, not legal texts. They do not issue commands. The formal normative expression of the commandment to rejoice on festivals is found in 11 texts that command the Israelites to rejoice before the Lord. The texts seem to command an emotion. Now, some contemporary scholars are dubious that the command to rejoice, to be joyous, actually implies having to feel an emotion. Rejoicing can be read to constitute not so much an emotion as a set of actions, a complex of legally mandated behaviors. The behaviors include bringing a sacrifice, having it slaughtered, and eating it communally with family and others. If it is the case that simcha, that rejoicing, equates to behavior and is indifferent to the affective dimension, to feeling, then rejoicing would not necessarily involve the emotion of joy, and this would eliminate the problem of commanded emotions, as the texts on this view aren't really talking about emotions. So if I thought this view was correct, I could just sit down. The Talmud in Bavli Pesachim 109a, the tractate on the laws of Passover, gives some credence to this non-affective interpretation of rejoicing. Quote, simcha, joy, means nothing other than eating meat. End quote. I think that there is merit in seeing the behavioral dimension as necessary to joy. However, it is necessary but not sufficient. The argument assumes that emotions in general, and joy in particular, are simply subjective feelings. It doesn't take account of the cognitive affective complexity of emotion. It is not therefore a satisfying reading. Rejoicing without joy, so to speak, is empty. Although the behavioral ritual complex signifies the mandated praxis, the dimensions of belief, evaluation, and affect are essential components of rejoicing. Doing something and believing, evaluating and feeling something are interdependent, equally important aspects. Analyzing this interdependence is key to the idea of a commanded emotion. Consider this text from the Talmud. After the destruction of the temple, when the behavioral ritual complex of sacrifice was no longer possible, the rabbis sought other ways to cultivate joy during the festivals. Quote, our rabbis taught, a man is obligated to make his children and his household rejoice on a festival. For it is said, V'samachta b'chagecha, and you shall rejoice on your festival. You and your son and your daughter, your male and female slave, the family of the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your communities. With what does he make them rejoice? With wine. Rabbi Judah said, men with what is suitable for them, and women with what is suitable for them. Men with what is suitable for them, with wine, and women with what? Rabbi Joseph teaches in Babylonia with colored garments, and in the land of Israel with ironed linen garments. Okay, the Talmud. Here the link between statutory behavioral rejoicing and the emotional tone of joy emerges more clearly. We are to have and do things that make us joyous. Elements of belief and evaluation enter with the responsibility of the head of the household to provide everyone with the incentive to rejoice. The householder should believe it is his responsibility to help his household celebrate, that the responsibility is valuable and good. That is why it has the status of a mitzvah, a commandment or obligation. He needs to recognize that his rejoicing is fulfilled only if he enables others to rejoice. Furthermore, the Torah's inclusion of marginal persons, slaves, Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows, highlights the expansive ethical dimension of the commanded action. It evaluates joy as ethically valuable. The commandment brings out the structural complexity of the obligation to rejoice. Maimonides underscores the ethical dimension in his code. Quote, "And while one eats and drinks himself, it is his duty to feed the stranger, the orphan, the widow, and other poor and unfortunate people. For he who locks the door to his courtyard and eats and drinks with his wife and family without giving anything to eat and drink to the poor and the bitter in soul, his meal is not rejoicing in a divine commandment, simchat mitzvah, but a rejoicing in his own stomach, simchat kareso." So Maimonides distinguishes between two types of rejoicing. An ethically valuable type, simchat mitzvah, the rejoicing of a commandment, and a common, less valuable type, rejoicing in his own stomach. He invokes a distinction that the Talmud had developed centuries before between natural, we might say, the secular emotion of joy and the God-centered commanded emotion. On Nozick and Hacker's hypotheses, emotions link to the values that we ought to care about. But not all values are created equally. The simple pleasures of food and drink, the hedonic values, in which one takes joy, are inferior to the high values of intentional service to God through joy in the commandments. I just want to say a few words coming to a conclusion about this distinctive rabbinic concept that links joy and commandment, the joy of the commandments. So this notion, simchat mitzvah, simchat shel mitzvot, the joy in the commandments, has several sources. So the first one is a worry about the appropriateness of joy per se after the destruction of the temple. Shouldn't Jewish life be in a state of perpetual mourning? If it were not for the fact that the Torah commands rejoicing on festivals, enduring grief might have been the most fitting attitude. The rabbinic solution was to construct the category of simcha shel mitzvah, the joy of the commandment, which fully legitimates joy by linking it to religiously valuable activities and commitments. As to joy linked to ordinary occasions and values, it is permissible, but shouldn't be excessive. Another source, a more interesting source, is exegetical or hermeneutic. The concept developed out of the rabbinic reception of and wrestling with the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, or what do you call it in German, the Prediger, is that it? The preacher, yeah? Ecclesiastes and the wisdom literature in general gives greater attention to secular joy than does the Torah. In Ecclesiastes, joy is found, quote, in the humble pleasures that sustain life amidst its struggles, eating, drinking, working, sleeping, being with one's beloved, end quote, a contemporary scholar of the book. The author of Ecclesiastes teaches that because so much of human life is beyond human control, opportunities for joy, which are given by God, must be seized and enjoyed. Joy in this and other wisdom books, such as Proverbs and some Psalms, seems more spontaneous, natural, and inclusive than in the Pentateuch. So I think there's a kind of a tension or even a conflict between these more quote-unquote secular or naturalistic teachings about joy in wisdom literature and the Torah's development of commanded emotions. The sages of the Talmud struggled with the teachings of Ecclesiastes, and in the process developed their specific notion of joy centered on the observance of the commandments. So Ecclesiastes both praises and disparages joy. Trying to reconcile that internal conflict, the Talmud in Shabbat 30b states, Rabbi Judah, son of Rabbi Samuel ben Shelat, said in Rav's name, the sages sought to suppress the book of Ecclesiastes because its statements contradict each other. How are its statements self-contradictory? It is written, then I commended joy, as I approved of joy. And in another verse it is written, and of joy, what does it accomplish? La kasha, there is no difficulty. Then I commended joy. This refers to the joy of a commandment, simcha shel mitzvah. And of joy, what does it accomplish? This refers to joy which is not associated with a commandment. End quote. The book of Ecclesiastes is saved for the canon by the sages' interpretive efforts. They reconcile its contradictory claims about joy by referring them to different types of joy. Joy not associated with the service of God is marginalized, whereas the joy of the commandment is commended. It's approved of and encouraged. In sum, to be commanded to rejoice means that we ought to care about the holy days, the act of prayer, the study of Torah, and the other occasions to which the concept of the joy of the commandment applies. We have a responsibility to care. We ought to find value in the commandment per se and in its intentional objects and actions. To rejoice has a strong public dimension. It entails helping others to rejoice. It mandates working to create a community with a shared emotional center and the prospect of common feelings. Given the constitution of emotion out of belief, judgment, and affect, commanding at least some emotions has plausibility. Feeling the affective dimension cannot be willed, but it can be cultivated, given beliefs and judgments about what is worth our care. In conclusion, the interweaving of beliefs, evaluations, feelings, and actions under the category of commandment is made thematic in a posthumously published essay of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, arguably the premier Orthodox theologian of the last century. Soloveitchik explores the set of commandments that correlate explicitly with emotions. In the words of a keen student of his thought, who is also a very keen student of mine, Professor Yonatan Brafman of Tufts University, these commandments include crucial ones, such as prayer, delighting in the Sabbath, honoring and revering parents, mourning relatives, and rejoicing on the festivals. In a posthumously published essay on prayer, Soloveitchik dubbed these types of commandments experiential mitzvot, which, quote, postulate a way not only of doing but of experiencing as well. The halakha, the Jewish law, attempts to regulate not only the body but also the soul, end quote. Such commandments have two components: the ma'aseh ha-mitzvah, the action of the commandment, and the kiyum ha-mitzvah, the fulfillment of the commandment. The former is the mandated behavior, the latter is an emotional state. Soloveitchik's innovation is to argue that the emotional state is critical both for understanding significant details of the commandment and for its actual fulfillment. That is, if one performs the action but does not experience the emotion, one has not discharged one's obligation. The affective state of the agent becomes integral to the act and to the fulfillment of the commandment. End quote for Professor Brafman. Thus, one who is, in Hacker's words, cold, impassive, detached, aloof, or stony in Jewish religious life has neither discovered the value of that life nor indeed of life itself. Thank you.